BDOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nidheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays, I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And this week on the program, I will be joined by Doug Lamoreux. He is the author of the book Saucy Jacky, and we will be talking all about the thought process of Jack the Ripper. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Before I bring Doug Lamoreux on the program, I would like to respond to a couple questions and comments that were left by you guys on some recent episodes. And I think the overall question that I would like to discuss is, was Jack the Ripper an influence on other serial killers? Because one thing that I've thought about in the past is that when the Dear Boss letter was published, the letter that gave Jack the Ripper the quote-unquote trade name, when that was published, it set off a chain reaction. It publicized this serial killer's identity, or this serial killer's nom de plume, to the world, and other people began to take note of that. And then there were definitely Jack the Ripper copycats across the world, but there were also similar serial killers who just operated in a way when we are not certain if they were directly inspired by Jack the Ripper, meaning that there is a small concentration of homicides in a 3-month time frame, 4-month time frame, or a 10-month time frame like that of the Zodiac killer. And the Zodiac killer is always a subject of fascination for me. And on the most recent Zodiac Monday, I received a particular comment about someone saying that they did not think that Jack the Ripper was an influence on the Zodiac killer. And I have to give a shout out to Jibber Jabber, who wrote this out here. Jack the Ripper again? I have studied Jack the Ripper for a few years now, and as much as anyone can with unsolved murders that go back to 1888, police forensics, psychology, etc., all in their infancy or were not even conceived yet. I really do not see any connection or even inspiration personally. How well known was Jack the Ripper in America in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, when we assumed the Zodiac was growing up and doing his thing? There was a letter-writing killer in California a lot closer in time and space to the Zodiac. I can see a definite similarity between those two, but I don't know how anyone can compare the Zodiac with Jack the Ripper when Jack the Ripper was not writing letters and giving us insights into his mind, with possibly one exception, the From Hell letter. Well, as I've just stated, I mean, there are other letters, like how about the Dear Boss letter that gives us Jack the Ripper's name, the Saucy Jacky postcard, and of course there are other letters, and I'm sure Jibber Jabber is aware of that. All of the letters are uncertain in the Ripper case, but we have the Moab and Midian letter, the Openshaw letter, the September 17th letter, the McCarthy letter. There are so many letters in the Ripper case. So I think that what Jibber Jabber is saying is that the letters are not confirmed. But this really is a fascinating question, and my response was, it's quite possible that the Zodiac knew about Jack the Ripper. Tom Cullen's book, The Autumn of Terror, came out in 1966. That's what I said on YouTube, but nobody's perfect, right? I actually double-checked the date, and it was 1965 when Tom Cullen's book, The Autumn of Terror, came out. However, what's more important is that the Ripper was known globally, from South Africa to Australia to the United States. Jack the Ripper was known in rural Texas in the 1800s when they tried to link him to the Midnight Assassin murders. And this is also known as the Servant Girl Annihilator. That's the name of the serial killer. That was 1884 to 1885. And there's even a Jack the Ripper suspect that also gets accused of those crimes, and his name is James Maybrick. And after an early New Orleans Axeman attack, the papers called him Jack the Axeman. Now, the New Orleans Axeman is a serial killer that I used to talk about a lot here on Black Box Online Radio, and the Axeman crimes occurred between 1918 and 1919. What I was talking about is an earlier set of attacks that some people think it was the Axeman, some people think it was not. And in 1910 and 1911, a very similar killer was operating known as the Cleaver. And the Cleaver was not a very successful killer. Mostly it seemed like the Cleaver was just attacking people. And in the second Cleaver attack, a meat axe was used, which isn't like an axe for chopping wood. Every description that I've read of it is that it's actually like a meat cleaver. It's just larger and heavier. But it was a meat axe. And when the media learned about this, the newspapers started saying that Jack the Axeman was attacking people in New Orleans, because you have the first crime, then you have the second crime, and they're saying, oh, we have a serial perpetrator on the loose, and they called him Jack the Axeman. That's in like 1910. And then you also have the media, you also have artistic creations. I mean, artistic creations about Jack the Ripper have gone on for decades, more than a century now, and Doug Lamoreux and I are going to talk a lot about this. I mean, we even have the first book that was written featuring a story about Jack the Ripper contemporarily in 1888. And that was The Curse Upon Mitre Square by J.F. Brewer. Then we have the novel The Lodger that was put out in 1913. But some people think that this is the first book that should be attributed to Jack the Ripper that's actually talking about the Ripper. But The Lodger was written by Marie Belloc Lowndes, and it is a story that features a serial killer that is clearly based on the Ripper, but the serial killer is called the Avenger. And then The Lodger was turned into Alfred Hitchcock's third film in 1927, and then multiple films have recreated The Lodger, most notably Man in the Attic, but The Lodger was also remade in the 1940s. And then we even get to the Jack the Ripper film in 1959, a film that is just simply called Jack the Ripper. So these sources are all around the world. And, I mean, it's quite possible that somebody in California would be aware of them. But I do want to point out that there was a story that was written prior to The Lodger, and this is The True History of Jack the Ripper, the forgotten 1905 novel. And this was written by Guy Logan. And the reason why this isn't credited as being the first book or novel about Jack the Ripper is because it was released in a series of periodicals. It came out in a publication that was on a weekly basis, so that is something that could have been assembled together. And that is not abnormal at the time, because we have to remember that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle even did that with Sherlock Holmes, most notably with The Strand, that the story would come out in the periodicals as opposed to being put out in a full book-length format. But all of these sources are very well known, and they most likely made their way to California in the 1950s and 60s. And one person who believed in this very, very strongly was Paul Christian, who went on to write the book Zodiac the Ripper, which is talking about this exact subject. And I have a book discussion about Zodiac the Ripper here on Ripper Wednesday, and one more time I invite you guys to hit the like button and subscribe. And one thing that was shared in Paul Christian's book was, it seems very apparent that the Zodiac Killer was using Jack the Ripper as a template. Short reigns of terror, both serial killers have letters attributed to them, the persona has been created, and also playing games with the media, the fact that the letters are sent to the press. It seems like the Zodiac took a lot of inspirations from Jack the Ripper. So what the book Zodiac the Ripper is about is, it's saying, we need to find out where were these Jack the Ripper related sources, which libraries had them, who was subscribing to magazines that talked about Jack the Ripper, who may have read the book The Autumn of Terror by Tom Cullen from 1965. Who was in possession of these Jack the Ripper related sources, and that could be a way to solve the Zodiac Killer mystery. I think that's fascinating, and it's an interesting idea. I don't know if it's the most practical idea, or more importantly, I don't know if you would be able to find the exact information that you were looking for, but I give Paul Christian an A for effort in that regards. And Paul Christian also has other books out about Jack the Ripper, most notably Jack the Ripper's County. But Jibber Jabber responded to me by saying, It's worth an episode of its own. What are the pros and cons of Jack the Ripper as an influence to the Zodiac? The main issue for me is that the Zodiac and the Black Dahlia Avenger, actually, were both seemingly playing a game with the police, almost inviting apprehension through the two-way dialogue established via the newspapers. Jack the Ripper was not doing any of that. Well, if Jibber Jabber is going to say that the From Hell letter has a high chance of being authentic, that may not have been written to the police, but it was written and sent to George Lusk, who was the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, so that is also a member of law enforcement, or somebody who is very similar to a member of law enforcement. Okay, he's not a police officer. He is the chairman of a vigilance committee. That's going to create a very similar dynamic. If the Zodiac was in his 40s when he killed Paul Stine per witness descriptions, such as from the Robbins Kids and Donald Fouke, then he would have been born in the 1920s and 30s. I just doubt that Jack the Ripper was part of the zeitgeist at that time. I think I've given several examples to the contrary about how Jack the Ripper would have been part of the zeitgeist at the time, even if you're going to say that all of these sources that I'm talking about are British. Well, as I've also told you, if the story of Jack the Ripper made its way to rural Texas in the 1800s and Louisiana in the early 1900s, Jack the Ripper was way more widely known and way more widely discussed throughout the early part of the 20th century than I had expected. As an American, the story of Jack the Ripper was more popular than I had ever believed, and they also printed stuff about this in South Africa and Australia, as previously stated, and other parts of the English-speaking world, so people were aware of Jack the Ripper in the early 20th century. And yes, the Ripper did become famous again by the mid to late 1960s. I think that this was due to the files being open to private researchers. Well, yes, and also the media was becoming more advanced. Film and TV were becoming more advanced too. But if the person who would go on to become the Zodiac was responsible for some of these SoCal crimes like Ray Davis, Domingos Edwards, and the swindles, etc., those crimes predate the reinterest in Jack the Ripper, and I think Jibber Jabbers means that that's before 1965 and Tom Cullen's book. I just have my doubts that anyone born between, let's say, 1930 and 1960 in the U.S. would have any in-depth knowledge of the Whitechapel murders. Oh, now hold on a second. In-depth knowledge? Who said anything about that? We're talking about the name, the Autumn of Terror, the dates, and this killer wrote letters. Is that not enough? That's the core element, that someone heard the story. I repeat, the story. Because as we're going to see, the sources that I was talking to you guys about are mostly not based on hard true crime books, saying that, there's Guy Logan's novel, and then there is The Lodger, and then there's the Jack the Ripper film from 1959. Well, those are stories and books and movies, even going back to 1888 with The Curse Upon Mitre Square. Those are pieces of fiction, historical fiction, and also fiction that has taken inspiration from the real-life story of Jack the Ripper. But that's not in-depth knowledge about the Whitechapel murders. That just means somebody was familiar with the idea of a serial killer who committed murders and wrote letters. End of story. And Jibber Jabber was saying, should I do an episode on that for the future? I actually have 2 episodes about the Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper. It's called The Zodiac Killer versus Jack the Ripper, and there's also an extended edition. So I've definitely explored this in the past, and of course I have the episode on Zodiac the Ripper by Paul Christian. If you listen to any of those 3 episodes that I just listed off, I would recommend the book discussion on Paul Christian's Zodiac the Ripper, which you can hear on YouTube for free. You can also read his book, and I do thank Jibber Jabber for writing that out in the comments section. This show is always interactive with the listeners and the viewers, and I do greatly appreciate all of that. But right now, I'm going to bring Doug Lamoreux on the program, and we're going to continue this discussion talking about the thought process of Jack the Ripper. How do people choose to portray Jack the Ripper in fiction? What was the Ripper thinking when he committed the crimes? And of course, all about Doug Lamoreux's book, Saucy Jacky. And I do want to remind you guys that this show comes to you Monday through Friday talking about unsolved mysteries. Those comments that I was reading off came on Zodiac Monday. Every Monday I talk about the Zodiac Killer here on BBOR. On Tuesdays about Sean Benet Ramsey. On Wednesdays about Jack the Ripper. You're listening to Ripper Wednesday right now. And there is Dahlia Thursday. But this week there will be a special bonus episode on the Phantom Killer, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders from 1946, but normally I talk about the Black Dahlia, and on Fridays, about D.B. Cooper. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And without further ado, I would like to bring Doug Lamoreux onto Black Box Online Radio. He is the author of the book Saucy Jacky, and he's going to be talking to us all about his thoughts and ideas regarding the Whitechapel murders. Doug, are you with me?
I am, Ned. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, and thank you for being a guest on Ripper Wednesday. And of course, if anybody has ideas for future guests on the program, future topics related to Jack the Ripper, they can drop them in the comments section down below. You can also write me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And as of course, please like and subscribe. So, Doug, I would actually like to go back to the very beginning. Do you remember when you first learned about Jack the Ripper?
I'm sure it was in the movies. I'm a huge horror film fan, and I'm sure when I first learned about Jack the Ripper, it would have been, either The Lodger or Man in the Attic, something along those lines when I was quite young. And like half the world, it simply caught my imagination. I'm a romantic at heart, so it caught my imagination. And I was also a huge, as a kid, a huge Hammer Films fan. And everything about Jack the Ripper feels like, as real as it was, as terrible as it was in history, it feels like a Hammer film. So it simply caught my imagination quite young.
And in the beginning of your book, Saucy Jacky, you shared a quotation from Robert Bloch. And were you familiar with, was it yours truly, Jack the Ripper, or Night of the Ripper?
Right, exactly. In fact, he sold that story a number of times. He wrote Yours Truly, Jack the Ripper for the Thriller show. And then he ended up rewriting it for an episode of Star Trek, of all things, an episode called Wolf in the Fold, where Mr. Scott was being accused of the Ripper murders.
Okay, then, when did you decide, though, that this wasn't just a curiosity or it wasn't something that you were only interested in, but you actually wanted to write a book about Jack the Ripper? When did that happen?
Well, I became a horror writer, I don't know, 15 years or so ago. My first book was uh, based on the legend of the Templar Knights. It was called The Devil's Bed. Then I wrote a Dracula book, Dracula's Demeter. And I played with the idea of the Ripper all along. I knew I wanted to write a story about Jack the Ripper, but I wasn't sure what to do with it. So I was writing other books while I was conjuring with it. And finally, actually, a little ways down the line, I have 4 or 5 novels down the line. It became time to try and write that book.
And in your book, Saucy Jacky, you do something that I find to be absolutely fascinating, and that is to analyze the thought process of Jack the Ripper. Now, the Ripper did some horrible things. The Whitechapel murders are some of the most vicious crimes that I've talked about here on Black Box Online Radio. And some people look at this case only with a curiosity about the suspects. Who was Jack the Ripper? What was his real name? But I think that there is something that is equally interesting about trying to recreate the thought process of the Whitechapel fiend, and that is, the foundation of your book, Saucy Jacky. And how did you go about the research process for trying to put, more or less, putting yourself in the shoes of the Ripper?
Well, it was, I guess, a number of different passes through the story. I had Phil Sugden's Complete History as a Bible for what happened factually. And then I worked at a hospital. I was a security officer at a hospital for many years, which had a number of psych units. So I was familiar with psychiatric patients. And I just kind of approached it from that way. Here's the situation. Now, how might someone who has certain mental problems might he look at the situation?
Right, and this isn't really giving away too much from your book, but if people do choose to read Saucy Jacky, the Ripper is a volunteer at the hospital, right? Volunteer working with medical professionals, correct?
Exactly.
So you incorporated those
experiences. I'm sorry.
You incorporated your personal experiences into the creation of the story, right?
Well, just in a way, the flavor of it. As I was writing the book, I would read something about Victorian England, and then I go, well, wait a minute, how would this affect the situation? Then I would read something about, the police at the time, and well, wait a minute, how would that affect the situation? So I wrote it in a lot of different passes, each time kind of adding new information, not necessarily to the book, but new information to my thought processes. When I learned that hospitals back in the day, healthy, happy, wealthy people didn't go to hospitals. Hospitals were for people who couldn't afford health care, and nurses were not, heroes at the time. It was considered sort of a dirty profession for a woman to touch other men and clean up after other men. So the whole thing was kind of dingy and gave me a new way to look at things.
And when you were creating the story for Saucy Jacky, would you say that you were more focused on making an entertaining narrative, or were you sharing what you genuinely thought about the Whitechapel murders and how they were committed?
Well, by and large, the first goal was I wanted to be entertaining. I'm a horror writer, and I wanted to write a horror novel. That said, I wanted to have it be, if not as true to fact, at least as real as it could be. So, I took the facts and I thought, well, this fact here has to mean this. Like on one particular night when he does the double event, if you just go down through the facts, it's very possible that Jack the Ripper was seen by 7 people that night, at least. And it's like, okay, there's a lot to deal with here. What is he feeling and thinking, not only as he's going through his night, but as he's being seen by other people? That gave me a lot to play with. And I think most of it was factual, but what was more important to me was that it feel real.
Okay, though, so if we're going to start from the very beginning of the Whitechapel murders, let's look at the story of Emma Smith, who is regarded as the first victim. And I mean, I know the answer because this is in Saucy Jacky, but do you believe that she was killed by Jack the Ripper?
No, I don't personally. And though the book certainly does start with her, and she is his inspiration. Early on, she's his inspiration, and later on, she's like a demon that plagues him. But no, he doesn't take credit for Emma Smith, and I don't feel that she was his victim.
And again, I don't think that this is too much of a spoiler, but when I was reading that, it came across to me that this may have been what you were going for. That Emma Smith is in the hospital. She's been viciously attacked, and she's dying more or less. And there was something about that experience that particularly, I guess you would just want to say, excited the Ripper. It was something that he found to be very exhilarating, and like you, as you just said, she would go on to haunt him, but he found it very stimulating. Did I get your portrayal correctly?
Yes, sir. That's exactly what I was going for. Right. And that angered him too. The fact that he was stimulated by it, and my Jack the Ripper was bothered by that.
But there is a very big twist and turn that happens in your story, and I guess to ask you what you genuinely think, Do you think the Ripper hated women? Was that like the driving force of his crimes? Animosity toward women?
No, my Jack the Ripper hated drunken, dirty women. He got along famously with he has a female landlord that he rooms with, and there's a very upright and forthright nurse in the book that he pays almost no attention to, other than to say that she's an elegant woman. He he doesn't despise these women. He considers it his job to clean up the filth. That's what he did at the hospital, and he discovered that the seed of his life had been planted within him, that he was to clean up the streets. So he considered himself to be an eraser of the filth. And so he didn't like prostitutes, and he particularly didn't like drunk prostitutes.
All right, though, but one thing that happens in Saucy Jacky is you start out the novel by providing a bunch of characteristics of Jack the Ripper, about his age and physical description. And would you say that your intention was to profile Jack the Ripper before you presented him in the story?
Yeah, I think so. First of all, I wanted my Jack the Ripper had to be entertaining. As you said, he's a despicable character. He's a horrible character. You can't have the people root for him. They're not going to. But I needed the people to be entertained by him because he was telling the story. And so, yeah, I had to profile him, and he makes quite a little bit very early in the book about how he will be described in a multitude of ways. Some of them are completely contradictory, and he finds that amazingly funny. And so he says, I walk with a cane, though I don't own one. I carry a black bag, though I don't have one of those either. And he's making fun of of all of the descriptions of him that were wrong. And in the meantime, he's actually giving himself away. He's profiling himself while he's doing it.
And for the listeners of Black Box Online Radio, would you be prepared to share what you genuinely think the Ripper was like? We're talking about age, height, weight, physical description. What do you really think Jack the Ripper was like?
Well, as I ended up saying, if you get down through all the words, I think he was about 5.5 foot tall. I think he was uh, brown hair, light brown hair. I think he was average build to maybe a little bit stocky. I think that he was educated in some way, and that's why I put him in the hospital, because I do believe that he knew something about the anatomy, but I don't believe he was a doctor.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I was discussing that on the most recent Ripper Wednesday. The more that I seem to think about it, the less it appears to me that Jack the Ripper was a medical doctor. We might encounter this very early on when we first learn about Jack the Ripper. Oh, well, he had to have been a doctor. I mean, he's cutting out the organs of women, right? Well, maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe he was somebody who had anatomical knowledge. And you will find that in a lot of the suspects that are thought very highly of, that they're just like, oh, yes, he knew things about the human anatomy, but he was not a medical doctor, because there's something that's very rough and confrontational with the Ripper's crimes. I mean, attacking the women in dark alleys and pulling out their organs. Those aren't medical procedures per se. I mean, those are actually something that's much more aggressive and in some ways a little bit sloppier. And is that kind of like more or less in line with your thinking?
Absolutely. Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, you hit it right on the head. Yeah.
All right, now, I really do want to ask you what you think about the crimes, but first, only because we've talked about some descriptions, do you have a real life Jack the Ripper suspect?
I do not. I know a lot of folks who do, and that's one of the reasons that I made sure that my Jack the Ripper was not one, excuse me, was not one of the famous suspects. In fact, I had a little fun as with Easter eggs. Actually, if you go through the book, my Jack the Ripper actually meets 3 or 4 of the suspects that have come down through history. He, as little Easter eggs, he meets them on the street as he's going about his business. But no, I don't. There's obviously, Chapman, Kaminsky, Ostrog, Tumblety. I don't know. And the reason I've never dug into it too much is because I simply don't believe that it will ever be solved. And so to me, it was like I could better put my brain cells on what I was doing with mine than with trying to figure out a crime I'll never be able to prove.
Okay, we might never be able to prove who Jack the Ripper was to everybody's satisfaction. I mean, some people believe that they have, of course, and they know who they are. But was there ever a suspect that really caught your attention and you thought, this might be the guy?
I don't know. I think Aberline, excuse me. I think Aberline was big on Chapman.
That's right.
And the weird thing is that like I love the movie Murder by Decree. I love it. And I like the movie From Hell. And both of those are looking at Prince Albert Victor, which doesn't even make a lot of sense. But I like that story as a fictional story. But no, I can't say that I have a suspect that I really believe is it.
And I mean, I can talk about the suspects, but it really is hard to try and pinpoint one single suspect and say that you've identified Jack the Ripper, or even that he's the most likely suspect. Because if you go through like some of the suspects guides, they have 200 possible suspects. Some are a little bit more far out than others. But I mean, just to actually say that, yes, this guy was Jack the Ripper. I mean, it hasn't been done in 137 years. It's a very big challenge. And as I said,
Well,
I don't have my own. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say Patricia Cornwell, she went after William Sickert, the painter, and that really seems to bother a lot of people. But I have to tell you that just as a theory to play with, it's fun. I mean, I don't mean to disparage William Sickert, but her theory is kind of, and his painting of the Ripper's bedroom is very creepy. So I don't know what to do with it.
Yes, with Walter Sickert. I mean the painting Jack
Yeah,
Ripper's
sorry.
bedroom, there is something that is like very horrific about that. And he also did the Camden Town murder. And if anything, it
Right.
shows that he had like the types of morbid curiosities that you would expect from somebody like the Ripper. But I don't necessarily think that Jack the Ripper was, painting in the studio like Walter Sickert. I think, if anything, it's kind of closer to what you put in your book about how somebody who was educated, but not through the university, right? Somebody who was more or less self-taught. I think that's kind of like the way maybe what you were going for. He's like self-taught, self-read. He knows a lot about different subjects. He's picked up things because of his volunteer work. And somebody who perhaps was not the biggest performer in life, maybe even somewhat of an underperformer. And we see that very frequently with serial killers. But yes, Walter Sickert gets my attention. And I've heard that the tour guides in the UK get loads of questions from the Americans because of Patricia Cornwell.
Oh,
Like when
really?
Americans do the tours, they ask so many things about Walter Sickert and that theory. What do you think about Walter Sickert as a suspect? So she definitely left an impact.
We probably embarrass ourselves. One of my problems is that I don't know a lot about it. I did plenty of research for the book, and I have my ideas of what I did with my Jack the Ripper, but I make no claims to being a Ripperologist or an expert in Ripper history. And there are so many folks, good folks, who know so much more about it than I do, that I come off looking kind of foolish sometimes when I try and talk about it. I'm a horror writer who gave it his best shot, but I don't make any claims at knowing anything.
Oh yes, absolutely. Like I mean, like it's okay to admit that you don't know something. I am also not a ripperologist. I don't consider what I do to be ripperology. But because you're the guest, Doug, I want to give you a choice. Would you like to go chronologically, and we can talk about the story of Martha Tabram? But you've already told me that you have some ideas about the double event. So would you like to talk about Martha Tabram or the double event?
We can start with Martha. That's fine. Now, keep in mind, this is one of the things when I was writing my Jack the Ripper, and I believe would have been the situation. He didn't know any of these women. He didn't know their names. In fact, he didn't find out their names until coroner's inquest. My Jack the Ripper is a big newspaper reader, and he uses the newspapers to keep up on what the authorities are doing. So my Jack the Ripper invented nicknames for all the girls that he killed because he didn't know their names, and quite frankly, he didn't care what their names were. But yeah, if you want to start with Martha, that's great.
Sure, because when I was reading your book, I think it went something like this. The Ripper sees a woman that he's attracted to who's not Martha Tabram, someone who is considerably younger, and then ultimately something happens where he loses sight of her, but then he finds Martha Tabram and he sees like a bizarre encounter with her and a soldier, and then
Correct.
ultimately we know what happens. Martha Tabram would be murdered, and this is when the Ripper has finally metaphorically tasted blood, right? He's finally
Right.
acted out one of these destructive actions that he had been thinking about for a long time. And any additional comments?
Just that the first woman he saw, in his mind, she was simply respectable. So she didn't need to be cleaned up. Then he saw Martha, and she had engaged in this awful coupling or an attempted coupling, and then laughed at the soldier when they weren't able to carry it off. And he was mad at the soldier, but he was in the soldier's corner. How dare she make fun of him? How dare she? And she was the dirty one who needed to be cleaned up. That's just the way that my Jack the Ripper thought of it.
Right, like that would tie into what you said about how it's not animosity toward women. He has a problem with prostitutes as well as people who are drunkards. And
Right.
those were the two terms you used, right?
Right. Exactly.
All right, then if we're going to go chronologically, after the murder of Martha Tabram, we have the murder of Polly Nichols, and this is August 31st of 1888.
Yes,
And
sir.
you don't have to give away too much from your book, and you can also share with me what you genuinely think about happened. Any analysis on that?
To me, that's the one where he actually, in my book, he sees her from the hospital. He sees her from London Hospital, and it's the same night as the London fire on the docks. And he takes this as a sign that she's the one who's got to go next. And she's wearing a brand new bonnet as she's strolling the street out there, and she's wearing it like a crown. And he calls her the Queen of Tarts, and that's how he thinks of her. And the fire is I don't know, the world telling him that she's next. And he goes back to the window to see where she's at, and she's gone. She's off to do whatever. So he goes down and sits in the hospital morgue and waits because he knows she'll be back, because that's what they do. And sure enough, she returns, and that's when he goes out to meet her. And he's very angry later on when the newspapers say that he's luring these women off to be killed. He's mad because she took him up Piss Alley to Bucks Row, So as far as he's concerned, everything about it is her fault.
Yes, and I was discussing this on the most recent Ripper Wednesday. When you line up the events like that, you can really see a similar type of thought process where you have the Ripper attacking Martha Tabram, and she is an unconfirmed victim, but in your story, as well as in a lot of theories, Martha Tabram was killed by the Ripper. But she's attacked, but Polly Nichols and Martha Tabram are reasonably close in age. Not perfectly, right, but reasonably close. And they
Right.
also were intoxicated out on the streets. And there is a certain similarity that you see where the Ripper's going after women who probably didn't have a very good chance of fighting back. And they're also, as we've said, they're drunk and they're in very similar situations and circumstances. And when you put the events in order, you can see the escalation in physical violence where Martha Tabram is stabbed, and then Polly Nichols is mutilated a little bit more intensely.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, now, next we would have the murder of Annie Chapman. Anything you'd like to share?
Well, Annie Chapman, she's so much further north than the other ones, and I blame that. My Jack the Ripper blames that on the funeral directors who were providing coaches to get the first two victims to the cemeteries. He had already determined what the price of their sin was going to be, and here were these Hanbury Street morticians deciding that they'd give her a gift and lessening the price they had to pay. So my Jack the Ripper decided he was going to Hanbury Street to kill his next victim.
And would you say that even in the real life Jack the Ripper now has this bloodlust at this point? If he has murdered two people already, and the murder of Annie Chapman is on September 8th. So we're going from August 31st to September 8th. And it seems like, I mean, in all variants of the stories, fictional or nonfiction, that the Ripper wants to kill again because, well, he's already done it before and he doesn't want to wait a very long time. What would you say?
Absolutely. It's his rage is accelerating, I believe. And plus, with the law enforcement is gearing up, and he's beginning to see the situation with the police as a game, and that's why he brings some items with him to deal with Annie Chapman to strengthen the game or to play the game better, and so he is definitely, I don't know, spiraling or revving up, whichever you want to say.
Right. So, but after the murder of Annie Chapman, this is when we have the debut of Jack the Ripper by name. We have the Dear Boss letter that was dated on September 25th of 1888, although it was mailed later. But would you like to talk about that?
Uh, just that he decided that he wanted to get some recognition for what was going on. The original murder of Martha Tibram got very little notice at all, except in the liberal press. The conservatives didn't bother with the story at all, and he wants somebody to know that he's out there working hard for the people of London, I guess.
Okay, so then that's the Dear Boss letter. But then now we're getting to September 30th of 1888, and this is the double event. And you've already said that you have some ideas about it, so I'll turn it over to you.
Well, excuse me. I'm trying to think how this. He was when he did Liz Stride, who he called the Squealer. Um, he Anybody who got in his way. I mean, he was seen over and over again that night. He was seen by uh, 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 who he thought was the Jew, and by the pipe smoker, and he was seen. Well, he wasn't seen by Dime Schultz, the cabman, but he was seen by police officer. But he believes that he was invisible because he was so normal looking. But when she squealed outside of the socialist club, she messed him up. And he'd already been seen and had yelled Lipsky to send the two that saw him away. But she had squealed when he killed her, and he was just so he had to get out of there. And when he got out of there, he couldn't go home having successfully killed someone because he didn't get to do. He was he's spiraling. He's wanting to kill viciously now, and he though he killed her viciously, he didn't get to stay and do anything else with her. So he can't go home. He's 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 going somewhere else. He's walking somewhere else and thinking about this and getting madder and madder and madder. And for him, thank goodness, here come a drunk whore dancing right up to him so that he could go ahead and get the success that he wanted that night.
Right, and I think that really builds off of some of the things that you put in the earlier sections of your book. Because, firstly, you mentioned the description at the very beginning, and we've already gone through some of that about how you said that people would give these conflicting stories and details about the Ripper. But in real life, there's almost some truth to that, right? that the Ripper must have been somewhat ordinary looking, because we have Jack the Ripper suspects with all different types of physical appearances and descriptions, different heights, different weights, different ethnic backgrounds. I mean, different class things. We've already talked about, like the Royal Conspiracy and Walter Sickert. Then we also have some of the other people that were mentioned briefly, like Aaron Kosminski and so on, who would have been on the lower end of the class structure. And there is something that is extremely contradictory. So I think that that's probably what happened in real life. And the second thing that I recall from your book is it's with the murder of Martha Tabram. The Ripper is telling the audience, or the readers, I should say, that he's not stupid. He's not going to let the victim squeal. And then once you get to the murder of Liz Stride, I mean, I knew that this was coming, because that's exactly what Jack the Ripper, or someone pretending to be him, wrote in the Saucy Jacky postcard. First one squealed a bit, right?
She
So,
squealed, exactly.
right, he lines all of that up. And I mean, like I said, that could very well be what happened, but I guess I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, the other thing that I foreshadowed is the situation with his mother. His mother was a terrible human being. She mistreated him. She abused him, particularly not only when she was drunk, which was most of the time, but particularly when she was sobering up. She abused him. And when she abused him, she called him dearie. And so then he meets Catherine Eddowes, who says to him repeatedly, "Call me Kate dearie." And mind you, she had been in jail, so she was sobering up. She still had beer on her breath, but she was sobering up, and she's right in his face saying, "Call me dear," or "Call me Kate dearie." And she really made him mad, because she really made him think about his mother.
Well, that's what's going to happen, though, even in real life, because Catherine Eddowes is going to be mutilated more extensively than any of the previous victims. Of course, Liz Stride wasn't mutilated because she was the squealer, which, again, the people who think that Jack the Ripper actually did do the double event, I mean, that's kind of the biggest explanation, that Liz Stride made some type of noise, and then the Ripper slits her throat, hides in the shadows, and then gets out of there, heads to Mitre Square. And Catherine Eddowes is mutilated more extensively than Annie Chapman and Polly Nichols. So there must have been something that either set him off, or it would be something where he was just enraged by Catherine Eddowes. And I guess the true story may be lost to time unless we can actually figure out what happened. No, but I
Right.
follow everything you're saying with that. And you can you might have to help me out with this one. Catherine Eddowes was the first victim to have her face mutilated. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, I go into it in pretty serious detail, but he specifically, she had no business having a pretty face, being the kind of woman she was. And so he takes quite a little bit of time, in spite of the fact that in my book, he is literally in a policeman's flashlight, in the beam of the flashlight. He still has to take the time to carve her face up, because she has no business being that pretty when she's so disgusting.
Okay, so after the double event, we then have something called the Goulston Street Graffito. Any comments on that?
Just that um, this again, what I did with that was simply the fact that this was where he was playing the games with the police. And he's essentially trying to simply walk away from the Aldgate pump and away from Catherine Eddowes, because not only are the police coming from everywhere, but he now has two departments chasing him. He's got the Metropolitan Police of the East End, and he's also got the city police. And so there are police officers everywhere. And he goes on and on about the way he moves. He doesn't move from shadow to shadow. He doesn't run. Um, he walks, and he's invisible, and he walks through the dark, through the light, through the dark, through the light. He's not going to be seen because he's so normal. That's his plan anyway. And he happens to, just trying to make his escape, ends up at Goulston Street. and he's hiding in the shadows while several police officers crisscross right there. And then he decides he has to play that game. And he leaves the bloody apron on purpose, and he writes his little story about the Jews.
Right. So it sounds like the way you've characterized that is that it's not a, I'm tempted to use the term red herring, but also a distraction. It's a clue that's kind of throwing people off, like throwing off the scent, I think might be more appropriate than red herring. I mean, if I've categorized it correctly.
Right, exactly. He's playing a game, but he at the same time he's leading them elsewhere. Right.
Okay, then. After the murder of Catherine Eddowes, we have something that's very bizarre, and that is that there is a big gap in Ripper activity where we have 5 weeks until the next murder, the murder of Mary Kelly, but we do have the Saucy Jacky postcard as well as the From Hell letter. And maybe I think we've talked a little bit about the contents of the Saucy Jacky postcard, double event tonight, first one squealed a bit. And
Right.
what do you think about the From Hell letter?
Uh, that's the thing. I get some criticism because, people argue about whether or not he wrote both, whether or not they're real. I just, with mine, I said every big clue, everything that, that history said was important, I was going to go ahead and just make it part of his. Whether or not he really did it, I don't know. But the letter allowed him to keep doing the, to get someone else in the game. Mr. Lusk, he goes to great lengths to criticize the vigilantes committee because what are they doing, sticking their noses in and bothering? He's got enough problems with the police, and there was more than just the one. There were a dozen vigilance committees that were out looking for him. So he was tweaking the nose of as many of them as he could. My Jack the Ripper, because he has a very crazy sense of humor.
Now, you can be as vague as you want about this, but to ask you what you really think in real life, do you think Jack the Ripper wrote the letters, or do you think that they were hoaxes?
I think he wrote the postcard.
The Saucy
I
Jacky
think
postcard?
I think he wrote the postcard, and clearly someone had. I mean, he sent a kidney, so
Right.
I really don't know. It
Hey,
was
no wrong answer. Just asking what you
yeah.
just what you
It's
think.
just it's disgusting to say it, but he was having fun, and I was trying to have fun with it, even though it's a horrid thing. It's a very weird thing to write something from the perspective of a killer because he's a terrible person. People are offended by the language. People are offended by the way he refers to women. People are offended by the way he refers to Jews. And I freely admit, Jack the Ripper wasn't a nice person. You know what I mean?
Well, yes, but when you say like, these are horrible things, but you were having fun with it, the way that I look at it in regards to Jack the Ripper and some of these other true crime stories that become historical fiction is people write novels about World War II and Adolf Hitler. People write novels about the American Civil War and slavery, and lots of bad things happened. But because they have the ability to find some type of creative story in that's historical fiction. That is not something that is new, and there is a certain sense of entertainment that people would get from reading books about World War II, the Civil War, and slavery. So why would Jack the Ripper be exempt? And yes, there are terms that are foul. Foul language is used, but that's only to tell the story more accurately. So I think anyway.
Well, I appreciate it because that's the way I think of it. One of the I don't know, most amusing criticisms I got from somebody once was that between the Catherine Eddowes murder and the Mary Kelly murder, that the book kind of lags a bit. And I I just thought it's not my fault. He took a month off from killing people.
Well, in all seriousness, that's why I was asking you about the time gap, because there is that 5 week time gap that is very, very bizarre, and we don't know why the Ripper chose to do that. Some people think that he was injured during the double event. He accidentally cut himself. Other people think that he was nervous about being caught. They think it's like there are too many police officers out looking for him, or the women may have had their guard up and he just didn't have any good opportunities. Other people think that he was confined to his home and that his family or the people he was living with wouldn't let him out because he's slowly going crazy. I mean, there really must have been something that prevented the Ripper from killing during that 5 week time, because everything that we have just said in this discussion prior to that is going in the opposite direction. It's saying, oh, yeah, the Ripper had bloodlust. The Ripper wanted to escalate his rage. I mean, like he's consciously choosing to go out and commit crimes more frequently. They're clustering together. But then with the Mary Kelly murder, it's not until 5 weeks later. Who knows? Who
Right.
knows what?
Well, I used a number of those when he's explaining, you know, he goes to a great length to explain why he's staying in, and there were all those things. You know, the police are just everywhere, the vigilance committees are everywhere, the prostitutes, he believes, are carrying knives with them now. So he's got a lot of things on his mind. Plus, I don't remember where I got the research for this, or to be honest with you, or if I just made it up, but there was a section in there where London was struck by serious fog for days on end. And he makes a lot of hay of the fact that everybody thinks that Jack the Ripper slinking around in the fog is a great thing. And he's like, absolutely not. He says, the last thing I need to do is be cutting some whore when there are three police officers 10 feet away from me that I can't see in the fog. So he's talking about doing his hunting in the fog would be a terrible idea.
But you shared one piece of criticism that you received about your novel, Saucy Jacky. Would you say that that was the harshest form of criticism that you received, or was there something more intense?
Oh no, I had one review, and I I actually enjoyed it. If you pay for the book, you can say anything you want, and I'm okay with that. I have one criticism. It was from a UK reader, and it was a one-word review: rubbish.
All right. Well, I think need to understand is though, like what we've been talking about is there is a creative process that goes into historical fiction, and it might not be exactly how somebody believes that the literal historical events that took place footstep by footstep. And I mean, because that's why I was asking you those questions at the very beginning, to look at how you were trying to create the Ripper, and it sounds like you were trying to put the story in line. And yes, of course, people are going to take exceptions with something like that, but I guess that's just life.
Yeah. Plus, you know, it never occurred to me, but while I'm writing this, particularly as I'm getting to the end of writing it, I was having a little problem with the darkness overclouding my personality. There were times where I had to simply walk away from the desk and go out in the sunshine and walk around and breathe fresh air, because it works on you to try to think like this crazy person. It I noticed that I was developing, and this is all seriousness, I was developing an antipathy towards middle-aged females. And it's like, okay, go walk in the air, go get some sunshine.
My goodness, yes. But the older I get, the more I experience it, because I heard one YouTuber say that, talking about true crime content regularly takes its toll on you. And at the time, I was probably 26 years old, and I was like, "What? I listen to true crime content every single day. It doesn't take its toll on me. I know that I'm not personally connected to these stories." 10 years later, absolutely, I get what he was
Really?
talking. I mean, I understand it. I feel it now, where it's like, you're hearing things about what Jack the Ripper did to the women. And firstly, and from an empathetic standpoint, it's like, oh my goodness, I feel awful for them. But then, as you said, when you're trying to get inside the thought process of the Ripper, you might develop some type of more, well, some more cold hearted feelings. And that's just unfortunately something that happens when you're exposed to this type of material.
Yeah, I enjoyed writing it. I like the way it turned out, but I was really glad to finish it. Yeah.
All right, though, but to follow with our Jack the Ripper timeline now, we've passed the From Hell letter, and we've said that there is this 5 week gap between the double event and the murder of Mary Kelly. What do you have to say about the murder of Mary Kelly?
Mary Kelly was special. He'd been away from it for 5 weeks, and not only was he going to do her what right, but he was going to dress up for it. I followed some of the supposedly eyewitness accounts of a toff who's out there killing someone, and so I had him become a toff. He dressed up. He gave himself a big mustache. He fixed his hair. He got himself a nice outfit. He went and bought her a meal, which he made hay out of the fact that they were claiming that he bought grapes for Liz Stride. And he's like, you got to be kidding me. Where when he got to Mary Kelly, he went and bought fish and chips specifically to lure in somebody. So his idea of that had changed. He was gonna do her upright.
And do you think that that's because Mary Kelly was the youngest victim and he was the most attracted to her, or he was upset by this young, attractive woman being of that profession, or do you think it was just a different motivation?
Well, his initial motivation, I think, was the same old one when he's up. But once he found her and saw her, and the fact that no sooner did she appear than suddenly she had a male companion for a few minutes. And now he's going to sort of, Jack the Ripper refers to him as the Watcher because he's following. Well, now he's got a new game. He's going to, the whole thing is just, I don't know, changing the way he's approaching it.
To ask you, how many books have you published?
11 novels published. 2 are no longer in print that I co-wrote with my late brother. But I'm working on numbers 12 and 13 at the time.
Oh, wow. And may I ask, what is the subject of the novel that you're working on? I guess you have two. What is the subject of the 2 novels that you are working on?
Well, I am a horror writer, so they're dark. One is a World War I ghost story set aboard a German U-boat. And the other that's called Black Souls. And the other that I'm working on is it's a story of Indian mysticism and Indian creatures from the underworld called The Old Ones. And both of those are in about the same state. I got about 300 pages done on each, and I'm trying to figure out in all that where the story's at.
But you just mentioned that you were working on this book about a World War I ghost story, and I don't know what your experience has been like, but to play off something that I said previously, I think so many people are shocked when they encounter a type of fiction that's associated with Jack the Ripper. But if you were to say that, you're writing a story, a fictitious story, a novel about World War I that's a ghost story, I don't think that people would be bothered by that too much. I really think with the wars, people might be more familiar with these stories, they might be somewhat desensitized, or they expect it. With the true crime cases, not so much. A lot of people are like, hey, it's inappropriate to glorify the killer like that. It's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We're not glorifying the killer. The killer's bad. But, like, I don't know what your experience has been like.
That's exactly right. People do give you if you're just I'm writing a generic ghost story, that's completely fine. If you say I'm doing this story about Jack the Ripper, you get a little bit of the stink eye or whatever. I don't know what the phrase is, but they're like, well, how could you do that? It's the same as anything. I'm trying to tell a story. The subject matter is horrifying, but that's what I do. I horrify you. A roller coaster to a lot of people is horrifying. That's why they want you to get on and scream. And they do look at it differently. The horrors of war they don't see them as horrors. It's just war. Where when you're in 13 Miller Court, there's no way to see that than just a very personal, horrendous moment that's coming up.
Right, though, but I think like people can tell the story and they can use their own fictitious elements, but they can still be respectful to the victims, and they can also portray the killer accurately, but not in some type of positive light. I mean, there's so many novels out there that talk about Jack the Ripper, and I think that once you get under the surface into the world of the Whitechapel murders, people will find them, and then they'll realize that it's not really some type of evil exercise to write a novel about a serial killer who was a real historical figure. Instead, it's just that. It's historical fiction. And I mean, people write novels about the former presidents. People write novels about the former kings, and they have their own fictitious elements that they incorporate into the story. And I don't really, I mean, I think that that's just real life. I mean, like, that's just what's going to happen with writers. Writers are going to tell stories, and some of it is going to be fiction, and some of it will be history.
I appreciate that. That's exactly it. I don't believe anybody's going to read Saucy Jacky and at the end, admire Jack the Ripper, despite the fact that he toots his own horn all the way through it, and he's so proud of his work, and he thinks the city should be grateful for what he's doing. He's crazy. He's horrifying. He's terrible. And the fact that he's never caught, as far as we know, should be horrifying. There are a lot of folks who attribute additional murders to him that I didn't go into. And, I don't even know where I am on that scale. But at the end of Saucy Jacky, you don't go, oh, wow, that's a great character. He's crazy. I want his craziness, his egotistical nature, his insecurities to show you what a terrible person he was. But he's not going to tell you he's a terrible person.
Okay, and on that note, Doug, I would like to give you the floor and ask if you have any final concluding notes for the listeners of Black Box Online Radio. If there's anything else you'd like to share about your book or any of your upcoming writing projects, now's the time, and I'm going to turn things over to you.
Well, first of all, Ned, I want to thank you so much for the invitation to come talk with you. I've really enjoyed this. It's one thing to have a book out there and have readers that respond to you, but it's another thing to be able to sit and talk with someone intelligently about the book that you tried to bring out there. And I hope that I told a story that's entertaining. I hope that I told a story that's scary, or at least, horrifying. But at the same time, I didn't mean to disparage anybody, the police, the reporters, the victims. It's a fascinating moment in history, and I wanted to try and give it its due. And I do hope that if anybody does read Saucy Jacky, that they'll take something away that they found entertaining or enlightening.
And one more time, I would like to thank Doug Lamoreux for appearing on Black Box Online Radio's Ripper Wednesday. And it really is nice to talk to the writers of different books and to hear how people explore the process of recreating Jack the Ripper's mindset. I think that it is one of the most fascinating mental exercises. But you guys can drop anything you want in the comment section down below. What do you think about the suspects we discussed? What do you think about the portrayal of Jack the Ripper? What do you think about the unconfirmed victims, particularly Emma Smith and Martha Tabram? We spent a long time on them. I would love to know what you guys think. And also, in addition to the regularly scheduled lineup, I also release shorts and reels Monday through Friday here on Black Box Online Radio, talking about serial killers, true crime news, and anything under the sun or in the darkness. And this week I've been doing a special series for the shorts on the D.B. Cooper letters. Yes, I've been working on that one. There are 4 D.B. Cooper letters that get widely discussed, and I've been doing a series on them, but next week I'll most likely get back to some more serial killer shorts, and the shorts come out on Facebook, Instagram, and here on YouTube. Black Box Online Radio on Facebook, Black Box Ned 88 on Instagram, and you're listening to Black Box Online Radio here on YouTube now. This show is available for free downloads anywhere you get your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, under the names Black Box Podcast or Black Box True Crime. You already know about buymeacoffee.com, so I will just say, I will see you tomorrow for the bonus episode on the Phantom Killer. That's all for me now, and until next time.